And when you talk about vulnerabilities, it's not always only outside the business.
The people have a price, and if someone's out there willing to pay for it, their loyalty goes to the highest bidder.
They're now for sale on the dark web, and they can cost as little as $500 to get you essentially full access into a company's IT systems. So it's pretty scary what's out there.
We see elements of that already in Australia.
Who are they inside organizations, and how do we stop them before they create havoc for us?
The security and the cyber teams are becoming aware that people are their last wall of defense, but they're also their biggest vulnerability.
These tools have been out there for years. If you know the right place to look and you're able to source the documents, it's very, very easy then to get through.
You don't need to be like an absolute hacker genius to do this now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of What the FTE. I'm your host Donal Greene, standing in again for Andrew McLeod. And today I'm joined by Darcy Healey, the market lead for APAC here at Certn. And we're going to talk about some of the most overlooked security risks in most companies. And that is to do with hiring. This isn't just about background checks. It's about insider threats, fake identities, deep fakes, and what happens when HR and cybersecurity don't speak the same language. Darcy, you're joining us from Bendigo, Victoria, Australia. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Darcy, what's your experience been at Certn over the last couple of years since you've joined us? And maybe you could take us through your career in cybersecurity before joining Certn.
Been with Certn for 2.5 years now. And as you said, come from IT and cybersecurity background. Used to do a lot of work with the SME, larger enterprise businesses, just around consulting, around putting a firewall here, MFA protocols in here, and the bread and butter type of cybersecurity. So moving over to Certn, it was quite evident that there's a big gap here from HR teams not being cyber trained, and sort of leads us to the conversation we're having today.
Yeah, and I'm interested to get your vantage point more specifically from the Australian perspective. So what's happening in cybersecurity right now that, in your opinion, Australian HR leaders aren't paying enough attention to?
So one of the big things that HR leaders face, they're rarely looped into cyber risk planning. The age-old premise of cybersecurity, you're only as strong as the people you've got working with you. In Australia specifically, we're seeing a lot of the mid-market and SME businesses being targeted for breaches. And that's because they just don't have the infrastructure or the processes in place. They're the easy vulnerability from the bad guys' eyes.
And when you talk about vulnerabilities, it's not always only outside the business. There are also internal vulnerabilities, i.e. insiders and employees. Have you had any experience of what's been going on in the local market in that regard?
Insider vulnerabilities and insider threats are not just really specific to Australia. It happens everywhere. I think in Australia, we do have a bit of that she'll be right mindset. Like, I know them, I've seen them, they're a good sort of character. We tend to take people on face value a lot. And that's turning around and starting to bite people quite harshly. With selling of credentials and things like that.
Yeah, I saw not just credentials, but VPN tokens. They're now for sale on the dark web, and they can cost as little as $500 to get you essentially full access into a company's IT systems. So it's pretty scary what's out there.
Yeah, I suppose the thing you got to be careful of and aware of is a lot of people have a price, and if someone's out there willing to pay for it, their loyalty goes to the highest bidder.
And we also see, like, coming from background screening, traditionally background screening has been a one and done check. So it's at the point of entry into the company, you do your background check and you essentially passed. But there's a post-hire risk drift, right? Where people's profile or people's risk can change once they've entered into a company.
Absolutely. We call it the box ticking exercise, part of the onboarding process, as you said, once and done. So let's screen the personnel and then it's set and forget. But people's circumstances change. They may fall into some sort of financial hardship. They may move into a different role and they get access to a lot more information, and that poses a bigger risk as well. So I think that ongoing monitoring and continual screening is just paramount to stay on top of things as well.
And what's the ideal frequency for ongoing monitoring, or is it very sector specific?
I'd say it's sector specific, and sorry to answer that like a politician without a direct answer, but
That's all right.
um,
You'd make a great politician someday.
the bare minimum I would say would be between like 12 and 18 months, but there is sort of caveats to that. Like if someone's moving into a higher level role or a role with more risk, there should be an interim step there, then they need to check them at that point in time. But then there's also some sort of compliances where you might need to do 6 monthly or even 3 monthly continual monitoring of a particular personnel.
Yeah. Do you
Um,
think in
the
background
thing
screening we'll get to the point where we have, for certain roles and certain industries, true real-time monitoring? So, for example, if somebody was to get a DUI or some sort of criminal conviction, that like the next day that would appear and their employer would be informed about it?
we see elements of that already in Australia. So using working with children tech, specifically in Australia, that gets registered against a particular employer. So if someone has a particular charge, or they, as you said, gets done for a DUI or a drink driving charge, a violent or assault charge, that would then be notified to their employer. On the same premise, security licenses. So someone working as a personal security guard or close quarter security, they're subject to the same sort of continual monitoring. I think for particular high risk roles, like you're talking around finance or banking, I'd love to see that sort of continual monitoring in place. As you know, at Certn, we do have this rescreening option available as well.
Yeah, and I mean, companies like Certain can certainly, that's a pun that wasn't intended, certainly offer that type of solution, but is the infrastructure there? So I think about like government criminal databases. Are they set up in a way that actually allows real-time monitoring, or is it sort of periodic and updated just from time to time, or at what frequency?
The infrastructure's there. I think it's about allowing the everyday user or businesses to be able to have access to that. I think that's where law enforcement certainly, and direct licenses or like security licenses, where you're working with children's checks, they have got that continual monitoring, but it needs to be made widely available for background screening businesses, but also organizations to have access to. There's a lot of government databases that need a lot of infrastructure uplift to be able to support that as well. Onus there, I think, is also on background screeners to be able to offer that continual polling of particular databases to see if anything changes. The big thing about background screening, it's a point in time check effectively.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think there's a combination of government providers of data and background screening companies actually coming together to provide better threat intelligence and better, essentially, security for companies, right? Okay, switching gears into the threat tactics that we see. So, what kind of tactics are catching companies off guard right now?
So threat tactics that we're seeing at the moment, as always, social engineering is the easiest one to do. It's cheap. All they need to do is try and establish some of the key points of the person that they're trying to imposter or relevance, and extrapolate that information from them. So it is cheap, but it's also easy to exploit, like during a hiring process. So utilizing forged documents that pass like a visual inspection, even basic security and tech focused, like digital solutions around. So you've seen a number of one of these providers or different services around that goes, we can inspect your document for you, but a lot of the time it's the person behind the curtain. You don't really know what that is, or the code or the tech that it's built on is just super simplistic. And the bad guys know this, and they're going to exploit that.
A lot of the time, it's just a human looking at a picture of a document and making a sort of subjective assessment if it looks genuine or not. And of course, the best fraudulent documents do look genuine. That's why they're successful in getting through so often, right?
100%. And like talking about that specifically, you don't need to be like an absolute hacker genius to do this now. And I think this is one of the big misconceptions is everyone goes, oh, these people are applying for an admin role or a finance role, mid-level management. Who's going to want to try and hack in to do that? You can generate these documents very easily and super cheap now. So it's the skill set doesn't need to be there from a traditional hacker standpoint. These are like very low skill level people in terms of the hacking world that are doing this. So that's what makes it so, I don't want to fearmonger, but scary, is that the HR people and TA the teams are having to face this.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And like, I could not write a line of code, but I've been using and generating fake documents for testing for probably 4 or 5 years now. So it's not even, Gen AI or, ChatGPT, which is driving this. These tools have been out there for years, and even tech illiterate people like me can go and, if you know the right place to look and you're able to source the documents, it's very, very easy then to get through sort of legacy identity verification systems. You mentioned one interesting thing about sort of role based risk profiling. So maybe historically background screening has just been a thing. So it's like you do the background check and that's it. How are our customers in Australia looking at role specific risk profiling?
I think probably one of the best ways that our customers approach this, and this is certainly something that we try and recommend to them as well, is have a risk-based screening matrix. So you have a level of roles. So starting at the bottom at like your entry-level individual contributor role, going right up to like an executive or a C-suite. And then as you move across, you have your different checks. And as the level of seniority or the risk for the role, the more checks that you're doing, because obviously there's more risk associated with that role. And that could be dependent on level of access they have, like spend or budget authority, all those sort of factors. You need to be able to do this. It's not a one size fits all for a risk-based screening. It's assessing a role. What is the impact if we get this wrong and that person turns malicious? Really, the framework that you formulate to protect yourself as well. Gone are the days that everyone gets the same access without sort of assessing the sensitivity. It comes back to least-based privilege.
Yeah, and I mean that's an interesting insight. Most organizations would have one of ISO 27001 or SOC 2, and I think many companies sort of treat that as a box tick exercise and don't actually apply those standards to their HR processes in lots of cases. In Australia, there is a specific workforce screening standard, 4811 2022. And there are some key updates there tied to risk tiered screening. Can you take us through some of the key points in this updated standard?
In the new updated standard, they've got a whole list of a combination of checks that must be done to meet that standard. So to meet the AS 4811-22, so this is the new framework that's been recently brought out. Employees must do like an identity verification. Traditionally, it doesn't really push you in. Does that need to be biometrically led? Does it need to be digital identity verification? It needs to be an identity verification. Our recommendation is certainly a biometrically led identity verification, ensuring the person is completing the identity check, and then sort of validating that that document's not fraudulent, it's a legitimate document, and if possible, verifying that with source, verifying identity documents and address history, right to work check. So does a particular person have working rights in Australia? Integrity check. So that's verifying an individual CV, references, and a criminal history check, either through the AFP or the ACIC. ACIC is the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission. Doing a credential or an education verification, and ideally doing that with source. So if RMIT or La Trobe University issued the degree or the diploma and I'm submitting that to you as an employer, actually verifying that with the educational institution that Darcy Healey did XYZ degree and actually completed it. And then a social media check. So looking at a person's social media footprint, looking for any risk factors that may prohibit them from carrying out a particular role, or if it's going to bring any sort of personality traits. It might be like far left, far right, hate speech, things like that. And that's probably one of the big ones as well. It just helps establish that full round out of a personality.
Okay, let's break down then the most common insider threat types that we see. So who are they inside organizations, and how do we stop them before they create havoc for us?
So probably a few of the most key common insider threats. You've got the privileged saboteur, so a system admin. They can retaliate like a post-conflict. They look for terminations, behavioral interviews, things like that, and that's when they'll go and cause havoc after the fact. So their personality and maybe write the wrong way or have a grievance, and that's when they want to go and cause some damage. You've got the IP thief. so intellectual property theft. So they steal all the data, they take it, and they can either go and sell it. If it's sensitive on the dark web, or they could go and sell it to a competitor. So the bread and butter corporate espionage there. To work around that, like resume validation, export, control of checks, loyalty probing through references, making sure that their previous employers speak great things of them, and that they don't say, "Hey, that person stole a lot of company data previously. I wouldn't hire them."
We don't think about IP theft as, let's call it a cybersecurity threat. But if you think about like SaaS companies or companies working in deep tech, it's very difficult to limit the access to proprietary data for employees based on role. And whether they're working in IT, dev, or maybe in business development, they do have some level of access to privileged information. And in an ever more competitive world, that information has significant value, and they can go on the dark web or via back channeling and create a marketplace for that information, which can net them tens of thousands of dollars, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's a big court case going on in America between two BPOs at the moment, or employer of records, where corporate espionage happened. They said to basically, allegedly happened, they sent a mole in to work in the other organization, steal their competitive advantage, and bring that back.
And these are just the instances we hear of that are publicized. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, this is happening pretty much all the time. And most of these cases never get into the newspapers, and we don't learn about them, right?
100%.
A standard case where a person is a disgruntled leaver. So they've been at a company for 5 years and something happened and they get fired, or they decide to leave in a sort of in an unhappy way. What information can lingering credentials leave open to these types of people?
If they've still got credentials and logins and that can still access the system, that's ripe for the picking. They can go and take whatever they have got access to. So I think that really comes down to making sure you've got the correct procedures and protocols in place. So like MFA, for instance, so if someone's been moved on or they've left the organization, let's shut down their access. You're not going to miss any particular tech stack because it's not all talking together through an MFA or a two-factor authentication, and that the organization has got proper exit protocols. So if someone does leave, for whatever reason, that you've got this checklist in place to ensure that the business stays secure post the employee leaving.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk about the rarely publicized cases of this, but it is getting more common that we see and read stories about things like that. You mentioned a case recently that really stuck out with you. Can you break it down?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the name because it's all through the news and media at the moment, but Coinbase, for instance, they had contractors. They were subcontractors outside of country as well. And the contractors were bribed to basically copy and paste all the data that they had access to. So it was personal information, the most sensitive information that Coinbase would have. They only had read access to it, but they were still able to copy that and then go and push that through and transfer that to the bad guys. So that was, I think the amount was trivial that they were bribed with, but we've got like 69,000 plus users of Coinbase data that has been allegedly like breached and sold or passed on to the bad guys. Things that could really help that is like a least privilege model. So a deeper assessment on our contractors, our temp staff, all staff, irrelevant of who's got access to what and for what reason. Monitoring isn't really an optional thing. It must be done. So continual monitoring, who's transferring data, where is it going, why do they need to transfer that data? And then post-access screening. So what we were talking about earlier before, looking at rescreening and what frequency do we rescreen and why are we rescreening? So looking for, are they involved on any global sanctions watch lists? Are they've been subject to like financial hardships, as with a credit check or a bankruptcy check? Bring any of this to a light at an earlier stage, so they could go and make these adjustments, or they could put the policies in place to mitigate this from happening.
I mean, lots of organizations kind of say we're compliant, but from what I'm hearing, there's a huge gap between compliance and actual risk reduction.
Yeah, 100%. So earlier before we said it's a box ticking exercise that in a lot of cases will make you compliant, but then do you really want to mitigate the risk for your organizations? That's where screening needs to be taken seriously and not just done as a initial offer and onboarding process, and then that's all forgotten about. Organizations need to have a deep look at their roles, what access, and then what sort of checks can we do on a frequent basis, whether it be 3 monthly, 6 monthly, 12 monthly, 18 monthly at a sort of nth degree, doing these on a continual point in time. Because checks, as I said earlier, they're a once and done and they're a point in time check. So if you're only doing this now, my circumstances could be changed. So from a criminal history standpoint, I could be arrested for whatever sort of fraud tomorrow. I could bring up a huge amount of debt, credit card debt, and be circling the drain. That's where you become financially motivated.
Yeah, and when we talk about talent acquisition, or increasingly now even CISOs at organizations looking at background screening vendors, as we always say, not all background screening vendors are created equal. What are the key things to look for when selecting a vendor and keeping these risk reduction methods in mind?
The quality of the data. There's background screeners around there that will promise all this and that, but they've got a sub-process that's got a sub-process that's got a sub-process that's got a sub-process. So you want someone that's got quality data and it's direct with source, because that's where the most truth comes from. So if you can validate something with the ACIC in Australia's instance, or, with a credit reporting body, or you can go and directly to the educational institution or the previous employers directly, you've got it from the horse's mouth. It's true, it's accurate. It's not clutched hands or going through 3 or 4 different businesses where things can be interpreted differently or different parts can be added or redacted. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is direct to source makes the biggest impact from a background screening vendor.
Are you seeing a shift in how organizations look at background screening? Do they start to look at it through the lens of actually being part of their cybersecurity stack? And follow on from that is, like, when you're talking to potential buyers or even existing customers, is it limited to just HR, talent acquisition, people and culture people, or are you now seeing people in security, IT, or perhaps even CISOs getting involved in the process?
It's a combination of all. I certainly would seen a much bigger lift in the cybersecurity and security teams involved in this discussions, because the security and the cyber teams are becoming aware that people are their last wall of defense, but they're also their biggest vulnerability. So they want to be more involved in the screening process and what screens and what checks are being done on a candidate before they're basically being badged on to the business. We're also seeing GRC, or governance, risk and compliance, becoming more involved in the discussion as well. And that's trying to formulate like that rescreening model and putting the policies around, if there's internal moves, if there's promotions, what point in time do we do a rescreen? We're starting to see a big uplift in that. Then also from the C-suite side of things, they're looking to really become part of the conversation, because there's a whole strategy around this. It's, let's implement a strategy so then we can formulate a process, and then we've got a well-rounded cybersecurity and TA framework or process that everyone wins. We've got a fast onboarding process, but it's safe and secure as well.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our chat, Darcy. So I want to ask you a couple of rapid fire questions to get your initial thought on a couple of things. So the first one for you is, you've obviously been in cybersecurity for a lot of your career, and now you've moved into background screening, which we kind of agree is part of the cybersecurity stack. So first question, what's one thing that tells you a hiring process is a security risk?
There's no screening tied to access level. So coming back to that risk-based screening matrix, the same level of check is done against a C-suite versus an individual contributor that has got no access. That's a big red flag.
Okay, interesting. And what's the first step towards HR IT collaboration?
They need to talk. I think the biggest thing is they both need to be involved in this decision-making process from the onset. Risk scoring, aligned frameworks, formulating the policies that everyone's happy. I know there's always the trade-off on speed versus security and how secure a process is. That needs to happen from the onset and build the framework from the ground up. Otherwise, you're going to be pulling in opposite directions.
And are background checks enough to combat potential insider threats?
Coming back to, it's a point-in-time check. So you can't do background screen on someone that started, say, 2 years ago, and then keep that as a valid background check. You need to be making sure it's a fit for purpose check as well. So if I come into an organization and I run a background check and identity check, or a police check and an identity check, and I'm working in an individual contributor role, but then move into a CFO role, that check is not really relevant for me. It's outdated, but what about the financial risk? What about, any sort of global sanctions or watch lists that I may be associated with the bankruptcy? Am I phoenixing businesses? So the check has to be fit for purpose. It's got to be current, and it needs to be ongoing.
Okay, and in terms of mindset, if there was one thing which needs to shift in terms of how we look at background checks as a tool against insider threats, what would that thing be?
We need to stop the once and done mindset. So it's not, I've done a check, that person is a stellar person. There's no adverse history on the background check, regardless of whatever you do. And then we trust that person forever. It needs to be continually done and treated as, ongoing compliance monitoring. Because people change, their circumstances change, their lives change. So we need to be monitoring that on an ongoing basis. It's like an evolving risk profile. So you just need to monitor that.
Okay, Darcy, let's wrap it up there with one final question. If there's one message HR leaders should take from this conversation, what is it?
You don't need to be a cybersecurity expert, but there needs to be an understanding of how people become the weakest link. As I said it earlier, the first line of defense is a person, but they're also the biggest vulnerability, and hiring is where the risk starts. So lock it down from the onset.
What a great way to end the show. Darcy, thank you for joining us this week. That was a wonderful chat. Great insights shared. Thank you all for joining us, for tuning in to What the FTE. We'll be back next week with another episode. So if you haven't already, like, subscribe. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your network. Thank you very much.